There's a question almost everyone eventually asks after enough failed attempts to fix, reach, or finally get through to a narcissist. Is there anything that actually works? Not another tactic to try, not another script to memorize. The real answer, the one underneath all the failed strategies, there is one thing, just one. And understanding why it's the only thing that works, while everything else consistently fails, requires understanding something we've built across this entire series, but that deserves to be stated in its most distilled, final form today. The only thing that actually works with a narcissist is complete, genuine detachment of your own well-being from his behavior. Not confrontation, not boundaries alone, though boundaries matter, not clever psychological strategy, not the perfect sentence, not documentation, not calm non-reactivity by itself. All of these things matter, and we've spent considerable time on each of them throughout this series, but none of them is actually the thing that works. They're all downstream of the one thing that does. Your own peace becoming genuinely independent of anything he does, says, or fails to do. Let's understand why this is the only thing that actually works, by first understanding why everything else, however sophisticated, ultimately fails on its own. Confrontation fails because it requires his participation in order to succeed, and we've traced extensively throughout this series exactly why that participation is structurally unavailable. His psychological architecture cannot tolerate genuine accountability without triggering defensive collapse into blame-shifting, narrative reconstruction, or counterattack. This means confrontation, however justified, however clearly and calmly delivered, depends on a response his psychology genuinely cannot provide. Boundaries alone fail, or rather, they only partially work, because a boundary announced without genuine internal detachment still keeps your peace tethered to whether he respects it. If your stability depends on him honoring the boundary you've set, you remain vulnerable to exactly the same destabilization as before, simply relocated to a new specific behavior rather than resolved at its root. Clever strategy, the calm delivery, the perfect non-reactive response, the pattern-revealing question instead of the emotional accusation, fails when it's performed rather than genuinely felt, because narcissists remain remarkably skilled at detecting performance, and a strategy executed from a place of continued internal dependence on his reaction will eventually crack under sustained pressure, revealing the very need for his validation the strategy was meant to hide. This is why, across every single conversation in this series, we've kept returning to the same underlying truth in different forms. It was never really about him. Documentation protects your clarity. Calm protects your energy. Non-reactivity protects your nervous system. Every tactic that actually works because it flows from something deeper, and that deeper thing is what we're naming directly today. Your own well-being, completely, genuinely detached from his behavior, his acknowledgement, his change, or his reaction. Here's what this actually means, concretely, because detachment can sound abstract until it's broken into what it actually requires. It means your day is not determined by whether he responded to a message, apologized, or performed the reaction you were hoping for. It means his silence and his contact both register as simply information about him, rather than as verdicts on your own worth. It means you no longer need him to understand what he did in order to know, with complete certainty, what actually happened. It means his suffering, if it occurs, and his thriving, if that occurs instead, both leave your own internal state fundamentally unmoved, because your peace was never actually built on either outcome in the first place. This is genuinely difficult, and it's worth being honest about that difficulty rather than presenting it as a simple switch to flip. Complete detachment doesn't arrive through decision alone. It arrives through the accumulated work of everything we've traced throughout this entire series: grieving what happened, rebuilding self-trust, developing genuine discernment, releasing the need for validation that this specific relationship trained you to seek from exactly the person least capable of providing it. But here's why it's the only thing that actually works, rather than simply one option among several equally valid approaches. Every tactic we've discussed throughout this series only becomes genuinely effective once it flows from this detachment rather than substituting for it. The calm that disorients him only holds if it's real. The boundary that finally sticks only sticks if you no longer need him to respect it in order to feel secure. The documentation only protects you if you're not secretly hoping it will eventually make him understand. Remember what we established in our conversation about narcissists needing your attention more than your love. His entire psychological structure depends on securing focused engagement from you, whether that engagement comes through affection, conflict, or crisis. Every tactic that fails against him fails specifically because it still provides this engagement in some form. Confrontation provides it through emotional intensity. Boundaries provide it through the ongoing negotiation that follows every attempt to enforce them. Even calm, strategic non-reactivity, if it's still oriented around producing a specific effect in him, provides it through your continued attentiveness to whether the strategy is working. Genuine detachment is the only approach that removes this engagement completely because it doesn't require watching for his reaction at all. This is the crucial distinction worth sitting with directly. Every other tactic still involves you monitoring him, even if that monitoring is sophisticated, patient, or well disguised. Genuine detachment stops the monitoring altogether. You're not tracking whether your calm disoriented him. You're not checking whether your boundary produced respect or pushback. You've simply, completely redirected your attention toward your own life in a way that makes his behavior, whatever it turns out to be, genuinely irrelevant to your own experience. This is precisely why detachment produces the effects we've traced throughout multiple previous conversations. His fear during no contact, his eventual crisis of relevance, his genuine confusion when his tactics stop landing, more reliably and more completely than any deliberate strategy could achieve on its own. Remember what we discussed about why narcissists fear indifference more than anger or even hatred. Indifference offers him nothing to work with, no thread to pull, no emotional charge to exploit. But performed indifference? Indifference that's actually still watching for his reaction underneath its calm surface isn't genuine indifference at all, and narcissists, remarkably attuned to exactly this kind of underlying need, tend to sense the difference even when they can't consciously articulate what feels off about it. This is why so many people report a specific frustrating experience. They've read about non-reactivity, about calm boundaries, about not chasing or explaining, and they've tried to implement all of it, only to find that he somehow still seems to sense some remaining thread of investment, some remaining hope that his behavior might eventually change, some remaining orientation around his approval that keeps the whole strategy from actually working the way it's supposed to. This isn't a failure of technique. It's evidence that the technique was being performed rather than genuinely inhabited, precisely because the underlying detachment hadn't actually been achieved yet. Here's what makes this understanding so important for how you actually approach your own healing, rather than continuing to search for the next clever tactic or the next perfect script. If detachment is the actual mechanism underneath everything that works, then the real work was never about learning better techniques for managing him. It was always about the deeper, slower, more difficult work of no longer needing anything from him at all. Not his understanding, not his accountability, not his validation, not even his suffering as confirmation that you mattered. This reframes something crucial about how to spend your energy moving forward. Instead of researching the next tactic, the next boundary script, the next clever response to whatever he does next, the actual productive work is internal, processing the grief we've discussed throughout this series, rebuilding the self-trust his gaslighting eroded, developing genuine sources of validation and stability that don't run through him or anyone like him. This work is less immediately satisfying than learning a clever comeback, because it doesn't produce the quick sense of having found the answer. But it's the only work that actually produces the answer, because everything else was always just a more sophisticated version of the same underlying dependence we're trying to release. Here's something worth naming directly, because it addresses a specific confusion that often arises once people understand this principle. Does genuine detachment mean you have to stop caring entirely, become cold, or pretend the relationship never mattered? No, and this distinction matters enormously. Detachment, as we're describing it here, isn't about erasing what happened or pretending you feel nothing about it. It's specifically about detaching your present tense well being from his present tense behavior. You can hold complete, accurate memory of what happened, genuine grief about what was lost, even genuine, complicated feelings if you hear he's struggling or thriving, while still maintaining complete detachment in the sense that matters. None of those feelings actually determine whether you're okay today, whether your life feels worth living, whether you can move forward with genuine peace, regardless of what he does next. This is the distinction between detachment and denial, and it's worth understanding clearly because conflating them leads people toward exactly the kind of performed hollow calm we discussed a narcissist can sense through immediately. Denial says, I don't feel anything about this, which is usually untrue and requires ongoing suppression to maintain. Genuine detachment says, I feel whatever I actually feel about this, and none of it requires him to do anything in order to be complete. This is a fundamentally different, considerably more sustainable internal position because it doesn't require you to fight against your own genuine emotional experience. It simply requires you to stop needing that emotional experience resolved through his actions. Here's what becomes possible once this genuine detachment, rather than performed detachment, actually takes root. Every single tactic we've discussed throughout this entire series, the calm, the boundaries, the documentation, the pattern-focused questions, the delayed responses, suddenly becomes effortless rather than effortful because they're no longer strategies you're consciously implementing against him. They're simply the natural behavior of someone whose peace has genuinely stopped depending on his cooperation. You're not choosing not to react because you've decided this is the smart strategy. You're simply not reacting because his behavior genuinely doesn't have the same power over your internal state that it once did. This is ultimately why detachment is the only thing that actually works, rather than simply the best of several competing options. Everything else we've discussed throughout this entire series was always a description of what genuine detachment looks like from the outside, not a separate set of tools you could master independent of the internal shift itself. The calm was never really the tactic. It was evidence of detachment already having occurred. The boundaries that finally held weren't really about better boundary setting technique. They were evidence that your sense of self no longer required his respect for them in order to remain intact. Because here's what needs to be said honestly before we address how you actually reach genuine detachment. There is no shortcut, and anyone promising you one is selling something that doesn't actually exist. This is worth stating plainly because it would be dishonest to end this conversation with a simple 5-step technique for achieving what we've spent this entire series establishing as the product of sustained, difficult internal work rather than a switch you flip through willpower alone. But there is a real, honest answer to how detachment actually develops, and it's built from everything we've traced throughout this entire body of conversations, brought together here into its clearest, most practical form. The first thing genuine detachment requires is completing the grief we've discussed extensively throughout this series, not bypassing it, not rushing past it in favor of premature peace, but actually allowing yourself to fully feel what was lost, what you survived, what it cost you to finally walk away or to finally stop hoping for something that was never actually available. Detachment attempted before this grief has been genuinely processed tends to be brittle, performed, easily cracked by unexpected triggers, precisely because the underlying emotional material hasn't actually been metabolized yet. It's simply been suppressed, waiting to resurface at the worst possible moment, usually right when you need your calm most. The second thing it requires is rebuilding the specific kind of self-trust we discussed in our conversation about the one betrayal an empath never forgives, and in our conversation about why you feel fake around a narcissist. Detachment cannot exist alongside ongoing self-doubt, because if you're still uncertain whether your own perception of what happened is accurate, some part of you remains dependent on external confirmation, which means some part of you remains vulnerable to his narrative, his eventual explanation, his potential acknowledgement functioning as the validation you're still secretly waiting for. Rebuilding self-trust means learning to hold your own accurate memory and perception as sufficient, complete, and valid entirely on their own, without requiring his agreement to feel settled. The third thing it requires is developing genuine alternative sources of meaning, connection, and validation that have nothing to do with him or with anyone resembling him. This matters enormously because detachment from one specific person's approval doesn't develop in a vacuum. It develops alongside genuine investment in relationships, work, and pursuits that provide real stability and real validation through healthy, reciprocal means. Without this alternative foundation, there's a specific risk worth naming directly: the emptiness. His validation, once filled, doesn't simply disappear once you stop seeking it from him. It needs to be filled by something, and if nothing genuine takes its place, some part of you may remain susceptible to seeking exactly this kind of validation from the next person who offers a similar dynamic, regardless of how much intellectual understanding you've developed about the pattern itself. The fourth thing it requires, and this is worth stating directly because it addresses something many people skip past in their eagerness to feel finished with this entire process, is time. Not indefinite time, not permission to remain stuck, but genuine acknowledgement that detachment of this depth typically develops gradually, through repeated practice, through the accumulation of moments where you notice yourself responding differently than you used to, rather than through a single decisive turning point after which everything is simply permanently resolved. Expecting immediate, complete detachment sets up an unrealistic standard that, when it's inevitably not met right away, produces exactly the kind of self-blame and discouragement that can derail the slower, more sustainable process actually required. Here's what's worth understanding about how to recognize genuine progress along this path, because it doesn't always look like what you might expect. Progress often looks less like a dramatic absence of feeling and more like a shrinking gap between trigger and recovery. Early on, hearing about him, encountering a reminder, receiving unexpected contact might destabilize you for days. As genuine detachment develops, this same kind of trigger might still produce a reaction because you're human and the history was real, but the recovery time shrinks considerably, hours instead of days. A passing thought instead of a spiral, a brief flicker of old feeling that resolves on its own rather than requiring active management to work through. This is worth understanding clearly because it prevents a specific kind of discouragement that often derails people partway through this process. The assumption that any remaining reaction at all means detachment hasn't actually developed, that genuine progress would mean feeling literally nothing whatsoever. This standard is both unrealistic and unnecessary. Genuine detachment doesn't require the complete absence of feeling. It requires that whatever feeling does arise no longer determines your overall well-being, no longer derails your day, no longer requires resolution through anything happening on his side of the equation in order for you to move forward. Here's the final piece worth understanding, one that ties together everything we've traced throughout this entire series into its most practical, actionable form. If you find yourself unsure whether you've actually achieved genuine detachment or whether you're still performing a more sophisticated version of the same old dependence, there's a simple, honest question worth asking yourself regularly. Would I feel exactly as okay if I never found out anything else about him again? No updates, no news of his struggle or his thriving, no eventual acknowledgement, nothing at all, forever. If the honest answer is yes, genuine detachment has likely taken root, regardless of how much complicated feeling might still occasionally surface. If the honest answer is no, if some part of you still needs eventual information, eventual validation, eventual proof that you mattered, or that he suffered, or that he finally understood, this is valuable, non-judgmental information about where you actually are in this process, rather than evidence of failure. It simply tells you where the remaining work lives, which is considerably more useful than pretending detachment has been achieved when it genuinely hasn't yet. This is ultimately why detachment is the only thing that actually works with a narcissist, and why every other tactic we've discussed throughout this entire series was always, in some sense, a description of what detachment looks like in practice rather than a separate path to the same destination. You cannot outmaneuver, outsmart, or outstrategize someone whose psychological survival depends on your continued engagement, using tactics that still require your continued engagement to execute. The only genuine exit is removing your own well-being from the equation entirely, not through performance, not through willpower alone, but through the slower, harder, more sustainable work of grieving fully, rebuilding self-trust completely, developing real sources of validation elsewhere, and giving yourself the actual time this process requires. Once this genuine detachment takes root, you'll likely notice something remarkable. You no longer need to remember any of the specific tactics we've traced across this entire series. The calm arrives naturally. The boundaries hold without effort. The documentation, if you still need it at all, exists simply as practical protection rather than as ongoing evidence gathering for a case you're still hoping to eventually win. Everything simplifies because the complexity was never actually in the tactics. It was always in the dependence those tactics were trying, imperfectly, to manage. He needed your engagement in every form it could take. The only thing that actually works is finally, completely, no longer having any left to give him. Not because you're punishing him, but because you've finally, genuinely, given it all to yourself instead.